controller is intended for the writers over at MikuFan.com. It was sent to me for free to make a video prior to forwarding it to them. As such, this video is me exploring this controller from a do I want to buy this perspective. I have been given no narrative or direction for what to say, although I did keep in contact with DAO whilst piecing this video together. In doing so, we get some extra insight. DAO did not ask me to change anything, I said.
Left. Right. Let's begin. A huge thanks to GamoTwo and MikuFan for making this video possible. And to you, the viewer, for showing interest and dropping by to take a look at GamoTwo's DIVALLER controller. This video takes a look at the DIVALLER along with how it looks, feels, sounds, works, what I feel is best setup practices and thoughts. I'll check the experience on PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and briefly on PC as well. I have both DAO and SANWA Switch options, so we'll take a look at how they compare, along with any behavioral differences I note with Hori and the arcades as well. Things to keep in mind during this video: note that at the time of publishing, there is no way of ordering this with both Switch choices. Okay, so here you can choose either the DAO customized button and 100g micro switch or the SANWA OBSA 100 UMQ and LHSXF switches. Ho ho ho, ho ho ho. It is a choice that you make at the time of ordering. The reason that I have both is purely from GamoTwo to enable me to provide you with some insight on what exactly your two options are. Firmware updates are possible, so some caveats or functionality may be improved or added.
In saying that, my advice to you is not to purchase anything over possible future updates. We don't know if, when, or how well it will be implemented. Only consider what is out now.
I received the controller on June 13th, 2020, with the SANWA buttons and switches arriving on June 20th. I made sure to have done plenty of testing, playing, and note-taking before even starting to produce this video.
I must express a huge appreciation to DAO and MikuFan for allowing me to take a year to release this video.
But at the same time, it's kind of important as it lowers any chances of missing any caveats or problems I encounter along the way. I have also been given some notes by DAO that suggests some aspects of this video may become outdated, so this review is based on the firmware update available in August 2020.
DAO has informed me that they have ordered and received 200g springs from SANWA, so the SANWA option may now come with stronger springs. If you have ordered this yourself and you would like to check, the 200g springs have 2 loops at the ends as opposed to just 1. And you can definitely tell that I recorded this at a later date. Remember that when connecting the controller to the Switch, you need to activate the Pro Controller Wired Communication mode. It'll just pretend to be dead until you do this.
You do not need and should not use the dedicated controller option in-game to use this controller. Having said that, the team is looking into implementing support for the dedicated controller mode on PS4 and Switch, meaning you might be able to have the option of their slide style or the real deal in future. That is, if your game also has the dedicated controller option. You see, at the time this video was published, the PlayStation 4 English version of the game does not have an option to enable the dedicated controller's touch slider mode, but this is currently exclusive to Hori's controller. So DAO are working on a firmware update to support the arcade mode that Megamix and the Japanese version of the PlayStation 4 game supports. They explained, however, that it isn't a simple one-to-one copy, as Hori has 64 points along the touch slider, where DIVALLER has 32. So they need to simulate some of it.
Before deep diving, I think most people just want to know if there are any glaring issues. I'll start off by saying that the two glaring issues that I had were fixable. The buttons can stick straight out of the box. And I managed to disconnect the soldered wires off the headphone jack. The headphone jack was likely my fault, as I did move stuff a lot. But having said that, I feel that a more robust job on the headphone jack terminals could have been done. Especially given the amount of air pressure that hitting the buttons can cause. It isn't a ton, but still, you can see here how much air escapes the headphone jack when I hit the buttons with tissue in front of the removed jack. Other than that, it has been a fun experience. There is a kind of third issue, but it is more user error. On consoles, you really need to make sure that the controller is set to the correct mode. If you're playing Future Tone or Megamix, you should have it set to Future Tone mode. And if you're playing F2 or X, you should be using the F&X mode. I'll explain that in detail later. Package contents. I'm going to point out first that a power adapter can be used and is not included. But you probably already have a solution for that at home. 2 USB ports will be fine. Any smartphone charger will also likely work. Basically, the LEDs need 900 mA to be powered well. You'll see later. So what do you get? You'll get the controller in a well-padded box, a manual, and a couple of cables. The manual is actually available online. I provided a link in the description if you want to check it out yourself. The cables are not connected to the controller, so you could potentially buy your own to adjust the lengths according to your setup. The first thing that you should probably do when you receive the controller is, well, unbox it. After that is to probably test that everything works properly. For example, spam the main 4 buttons quickly for a moment to make sure that they bounce back well. Press the buttons at different angles to see if they stick. If so, try reseating the spring and see if that fixes it. Connect the controller and make sure that the touch slider and all buttons work. I suggest using the PC for this, as you can go into a 16-key mode and see if the touch slider types out all the keys that it should. Connect the headphones and play something like a sound test to make sure that the left and right speakers of the headphone jack are working correctly. Just be careful because I found that the headphone jack for some reason worked at the maximum volume when connected to the PC. The Windows sound settings didn't seem to affect it. And cycle all the LED colors to see if any of the individual LEDs misbehave. Looking good? Great. Something obviously extremely broken that you can't fix yourself? I suggest you contact DAO. Their warranty states that they will bear the cost of shipping on the first 7 days only. So, I wouldn't wait. Look and feel. A look at the controller. The DIVALLER controller is a third-party controller designed with Project Diva, Future Tone, and Megamix in mind. It features every button the Project Diva games asks you to use, with ways to play Dreamy Theater, F&X games as well. The single controller will work on PS3, PS4, Switch, and PC. So, no need to have more than one, or to use a third-party adapter, which might not even work properly, unlike with Hori. There are no analog sticks to be found, making it near impossible to play any other game.
Unlike with Hori. In case you are unaware, all games prior to Future Tone were designed for consoles with a handheld controller in mind. Thus, you'll find the patterns and mechanics suit more. For example, there are much more frequent, quick triple notes or long strings of the same note in the console games. That is because in the console games, you are basically expected to alternate between the D-pad and the face buttons on higher difficulties. But this is Future Tone and Megamix. It's this arcade machine that has been ported to the consoles. Initially released in 2010, it presents a single line of buttons, with a touch slider added about 3.5 years later. This is why not all songs use the slider. This is why the PVs have a variation of mechanical and natural motion. That and a lot of early songs were contest winners who created PVs in the PSP game. You'll also notice that the note charts evolve, as naturally, arcade players got better and more creative over time as well. X Extreme was also added later, most notably adding slide notes to older songs. Songs were added frequently up until December 21st, 2016, where they added Amatsu Kitsune and 1925.
After that, the game went quiet for a year. Then they added Dune and Ghost Rule on December 13th, 2017. 3 years later, Ghost Rule was removed from the arcades.
This sadly suggests that the arcade cabinet hardware either really needs a refresh, or, more likely, Sega has simply moved on to their current trio of music rhythm games, Mai, Tunithm, and Ongeki.
39, or Sankyu, is also set to discontinue on March 10th.
Hello, past myself. It turned out that this news changed. The day before Sankyu was going to be pulled, Sega announced that in response to customer feedback, they will in fact not be pulling Sankyu and will instead actually put Ghost Rule back. Carry on then. Carry on then.
So basically, in Future Tone for PS4 or Megamix in arcade mode for Switch, since you can't get creative with 4 giant buttons, you're presented with fully customizable controls and macro options to try do your best to remap and deal with note charts designed for this on one of these. Conversely, although possible, I suspect you will enjoy the previous games designed for a controller with a controller. More than an arcade cabinet layout. So, an arcade layout controller for home? Available officially for gamers outside Japan? Oh yes, please. The first thing you're gonna notice is how heavy the controller is. It's over 9,000 grams. The controller dimensions are conveniently shown on their website. Length, 696mm. Width, 240mm. Height, 120mm. The controller comes with these 2-meter cables. Cables are cables, really. They are 2 meters and, well, they cable like you should expect a cable to cable.
The USB Type-C is only really to power the slider's lights. you can still play without it. The USB Type-B is for data.
The controller reports at 1000 Hz to the host, so the device it is connected to should, in theory, be able to acknowledge a button press or depress every millisecond. I tested this by trying an online scan rate estimator website and flicking my hand across the slider as fast as I could.
This is SANWA. This is DAO. Clicky clicky. Not clicky clicky, 200 gram. 100 gram. This is a DAO with a 200 gram spring. That's the 100 plus 60. Yeah, touch later.
Indeed, I managed to achieve 1 millisecond inputs. So, this appears to be true. Compared to the Hori controller, DIVALLER makes the Hori controller feel very light, which, light is good, but it also makes it feel more cheaply made. That doesn't mean Hori is easier to transport. DIVALLER's detachable cables make the permanently connected one on Hori suddenly annoying, as you realize you always have to hold or manage the cable while carrying it. Having said that, when playing on the Hori, the housing, weight, or build is immediately forgotten. I did scratch my table with the DIVALLER though, so rip. Hori, plastic, rounded at the top, lighter, but still feels solid enough to play. DIVALLER, weapon. Customization with the DIVALLER is possible. DAO welcomes you to bust out a screwdriver and perform some maintenance or adjustments yourself. They even provide templates should you want to design your own and change the slider, face panel, and button images. You could also, for example, add more weight to the buttons by sourcing and changing the springs in the buttons too.
If you are wondering about how to change the decals on the controller, you will have to completely disconnect the function button from the main board, which can then easily be popped out from underneath. Once all 4 buttons are removed, simply lift the cover. Then, if you actually did remove the function button, you could take the decal out in favor of your own. Getting at the touch slider would require further disassembly. This is also handy to know if dust gets under that you just want to remove.
A look at the buttons and switches.
The function buttons are also outstanding. Come with
The Kailh red switch. More than 70 million times. Custom round keycaps. Special surface treatment. Solid and durable.
The buttons feel nice and smooth. They're nothing to complain about.
Applicable to both DAO and SANWA options. You have 2 options as to what buttons and switches to get. DAOs customize buttons using Omron switches, or SANWA, what they use in the actual arcades.
Realize that the buttons and lamp holders in DAO's option are built by them, but you can still achieve an Omron switch setup if you so desire.
The main noticeable difference in use between Omron's V10 1A4 and SANWA's LHSXF switches is that the Omrons click and SANWA's are smooth and silent. You may love or hate this. That's the switches themselves. The buttons hitting the cup will be as noisy as a truck trying to drive under a bridge that is too low for it. Both solutions are designed so that when the buttons hit the cup, the plunger doesn't physically hit the body of the switch, so the switches are protected. In play, the deciding factor of the button feels are the spring's strength, the resistance of the switch itself, and the click of the switch.
This here is DAO's switch, the Omron. You can hear it click. And the fastest, as you'll see, is an 8 millisecond response. 9, there we go. I can't get any lower than 8. Moving on to a SANWA button, where now you hear no click. Again, the fastest I can get is 8 milliseconds. So the two are the same, really.
By using the scan rate estimator, I could achieve button press and depress speeds of 8 milliseconds with both the Omron and SANWA. So there doesn't seem to be any speed advantages over one or the other. I found this interesting, as I thought maybe the photo switch could essentially be quicker, as there is no mechanical switch that could actually cause a delay in the button movement. Just note that if you do want to buy one set of switches and try source the other yourself, it is possible, but more involved than you might think. The buttons and button housing DAO provide are different to SANWA. You can't actually fit the SANWA switch into DAO's housing, and the lamp holder DAO uses won't fit in SANWA's housing either. Realize that the buttons, the button housing, and the lamp holders in DAO's option are built by them. But you can still achieve an Omron switch setup if you so desire. The Omron switch's terminals are best worked with spade crimp connectors and go to a 4-pin connector on the DIVALLER's board. The SANWA photo switches use a 5-pin connector at both ends. So yeah, it's not just a simple switch swap. You could start with a SANWA switch setup and then buy the Omron switches with a lamp holder suitable for SANWA's buttons. Then do some handiwork yourself to make the buttons clicky, but yeah. DAO customized buttons and 100-gram micro switches option. Specifically, this option includes Omron V10 1A4 100-gram micro switches with DAO's lamp holder, a 5-volt LED lamp, which I can read T8 1 LED version 1.1 on the board, DAO's own button and housing, which their lamp holder allows twisting and snapping the micro switch into place. Wires crimped to the micro switches with cable lengths designed for a tidy enough cable management in the DIVALLER cabinet. Each button has 2 springs in them, a DAO custom 100-gram and 60-gram spring. The Omron switches are a Japanese brand. The 100-gram is the required force just to trigger the switch alone. On DJ-DAO's website, they claim to be able to survive 10 million actuations. However, on Omron's website, they say that they have an electrical durability of 300,000 or more and a mechanical durability of 50 million or more. But then SANWA's Recton store also sells them, and they say they are rated at least 100,000 electrical and 1 million mechanical actuations at a 400-gram force. That's quite a wild variance. What is electrical versus mechanical durability? According to Schneider Electric, electric durability is where it is used in operation, with electrical signals flowing through. How many times you can hit and have an electrical response without any form of maintenance required. Mechanical durability is before physical malfunction, so something straight up breaking, even if tested unplugged. I asked for DAO's feedback on this, and they said that we needn't worry about the electrical durability, as the current used is very low. In any case, DAO's dual 100-gram and 60-gram springs on top of the 100-gram micro switch gives a satisfyingly solid button press feel overall. The Omron click is noticeable both audibly and by touch, even through the big 100mm dome buttons. you don't hear or feel Hori or the arcade cabinet buttons click at all. Unsurprisingly, when they click, they trigger, so it is very clear when your button press should work. If you have a strong preference over clicking switches, then you'll be happy that this is the much cheaper option. Just be aware that if you ever find yourself ordering switch replacements, it won't be the easiest thing to replace, as you'll need to be able to prop out the LED holder and crimps. And again, the LED holder is designed by DAO, so if you break it, you'll have to source it from them. Also remember there is a warranty. Within 180 days you can send the controller back to DAO to do this for you, but shipping a 9 kilogram controller will be expensive. It's probably cheaper and faster for you to buy the parts and learn how to do it yourself.
You should be able to contact and order replacement parts from DAO as well.
SANWA. Often regarded as the industry standard, SANWA components are used in the actual arcades. Specifically, the SANWA options include OBSA 100 UMQ buttons, OBSA LHSXF switches where 70 grams is required to trigger them, 5-volt LED lamps, some Yaobo 5-pin cables to connect them to the DIVALLER's board, and their DAO custom 100 gram springs. That means the switch and the total spring strength is much less than DAO's option. The switches are the best I can see from SANWA. They are optical photo switches, so are completely silent and cannot be felt. They really are ninja switches when in place. It says here that LHS XF switches use a photo sensor, that a non-contact switch increases their electrical durability dramatically, but also their power consumption. This would explain the reason why the Omron switch has a 4-pin connector and SANWA's photo switch has a 5-pin one. At the time of review, DAO opted to include DAO customized 100 gram springs as opposed to SANWA's 200 gram springs that is used at the arcades.
Well, at least the standard spec. One of the Sega buildings in Akiba had both normal and soft button machines. That is a thing.
DAO are very open about this on their website, and I can confirm that these feel lighter than the arcades. As mentioned at the start of the video though, they are looking at changing that to the 200 gram springs. If you choose the SANWA option, and you find that you need to order new LHS XF switches, be aware that they are very expensive. However, swapping them out will be a very easy process. They are supposed to be able to survive more than 5 million actuations. Comparing with the Hori buttons, DIVALLER seems a little louder when you hit the buttons. The buttons sort of wobble and bounce a bit in place more than Hori. This doesn't detract from the gameplay itself, however. Interestingly, Hori's buttons depress easier than DIVALLER, a little too easily in fact. Sometimes I even let go of the hold notes, despite holding the button down, simply due to the angle I hit the button, where adjusting my hands caused one side of the button to lift enough to be considered let go. I've even triggered another button press in the process, losing not only my hold, but my combo. So, initially, the Hori controller buttons feel like they are housed better. But when you play, you realize that the DIVALLER button design, which is basically the arcades, are probably more reliable.
Alright, to clarify, Hori can disengage if you rock the button in any direction. DAO's solution with Omron switches can disengage when you rock the button towards you. So naturally I took the button out to see why. It's clicking when I pull back like that, which is the likely direction that you might hit the button. It's actually very, very simple. Having a look at the switch here,
can see that it just rocks off it like this. So the other way is fine, and sideways is not going to do anything. So the solution is really, really simple. Just put the switch in the other way. And now we don't have a problem. Very simple. Curiously enough, here we go, upside down mode. Curiously enough, it seems to be okay to rock both directions. So now it's actually a very secure button. So yeah, when you get your controller, if it's clicking when you rock it, just try that. Might help you.
The switches should come pre-installed with the triggers facing the player for optimal reliability. I believe that I discovered this through several Switch reinstallations.
And SANWA, you're safe, unless you try to pull the button up. But yeah, that's not gonna happen in gameplay.
Just remember, unlike Hori, you can't pop the domes off from the top of the DIVALLER. So, whatever you do, don't try to push down and rotate the buttons like you can with Hori's controller. To perform any button maintenance for the DIVALLER, open the controller from underneath by removing the 8 screws, remove the button switch, and even remove the entire button if necessary. Parts shopping and pricing in Japan. In doing some parts shopping in Japan, we can see any value that DAO offers in charging an additional $159 for the SANWA configuration. In short, if you add all the parts to a shopping cart in SANWA Denshi's Rakuten store, it's considerably more expensive. Omron switches on their own are very cheap, so despite the fact that they are included in the buttons I've chosen here, it's insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The cost of the switches alone say a lot. Sound. These controllers are loud. If you live in a noise-sensitive area, your neighbors may think you're letting off firecrackers in your room, so you might want to think about how to manage that. It's nothing like pressing buttons on a PS4 controller. DAO's buttons are quite clicky, which automatically means noisier than a PS4 controller, even on the lightest possible press. But the DIVALLER controller's 100mm buttons are monstrously larger than a PS4 controller's buttons. And you'll hit them with a monstrous amount of more energy, so that monstrously adds to the noise. Actually, I immediately felt that the DIVALLER was much louder than Hori's controllers too, making the cheaper build feel sound better built. I really want to open Hori's controller to see how they are built, but it's still under warranty, so I'm leaving it alone. As DAO basically encourages you to open theirs, this is easy to scope out. The biggest factor would be the plastic buttons slamming against the plastic cup when you hit them. You could therefore dampen the sound by adding a thin, soft cloth layer between the button and the cup, such as a microfiber cloth that glasses often come with, but it won't silence them. I also thought the added noise could be due to the mostly hollow metal design of the whole controller, like you're hitting a drum when playing. So I picked up some egg-shaped acoustic foam to jam inside the controller just to see if it would make any difference. But when I tried, I couldn't tell. I suspect to really cut the sound down, I'd need to do some more sound dampening inside the controller and the button cups as well. Possibly even extra bracing inside the controller. But this could quickly get very expensive, like high-end speaker manufacturing. Anyway, to demonstrate what it sounds like, I figured the best way to do this is to install 2 SANWA buttons, 2 DAO buttons,
grab both DIVALLER and Hori, chuck a mic in the middle, and slap. I positioned the mic 60 centimeters from the controllers for close-up noise, and then moved the mic back to 3 meters to give an idea of the sound traveling through the room. I hit every button a few times at varying forces. I also played some more difficult songs to see how loud I'd hit when actually playing. Let's have a listen.
DIVALLER at 3 meters.
And for laughs, if I played the PS4 controller, it would sound like this in comparison. Oh, and we can't go without some ASMR style sound of pushing the buttons softly. In action. In action. Connecting the controller. The controller has 2 USB sockets.
The USB Type-B port is what sends inputs to the console or PC.
The controller is fully functional with just the one cable. The USB Type-C socket connects to power the lights. The manual states that you should connect the USB Type-C cable to a USB 3 interface, or any power adapter with 5 volts and more than 1 amp current.
Remember that the LEDs need 900 milliamps to be properly powered. USB 2 provides up to 500 milliamps, and USB 3 can provide 900.
The tech specs of the PS4 state that it has 2 USB 3.1 Gen 1 ports, so you should be able to just use the 2 ports at the front. For the Switch, the dock potentially has a USB 3 port at the back, but it still functions as a USB 2 port. I tried connecting the controller to the two USB ports on the side and it worked fine, but understand that some USB ports may not provide enough power. If you don't have a spare USB port and want the slider lights, I'm pretty sure that any mobile phone charger will do, as long as it has a female USB Type A connector on it. And as the manual says, 5 volts, minimum 1 amp output.
Wow! I discovered something new! To let you know, although there is no problem using the USB ports on the consoles, they do not provide all the power the slider lights can actually potentially use. Let me show you what happens if you try light up the entire slider when connected to the switch. A few ports are fine. That light's no problem. Let's try, whoa, that's interesting. Let's try a different color. No problem, okay. Don't know what's going on there now. Oh! Ow! Okay, so the touch slider just stopped. Huh. That's interesting. Oh, in case you were wondering, if you do put the touch slider LEDs to sleep while you're playing, the slider still works fine. And what happens here is, if I unplug the cable from the controller and plug it back in again, touch slider cable, come on, yeah! It didn't turn back on, did it? How about if I unplug the USB 2 cable, the data cable? And plug that back in. Again, the touch slider hasn't turned back on. How about if I unplug it from the switch? I'll try both cables. The touch slider still has not re-engaged. Did I break it? Well, no. All I really need to do is turn the dock off and back on again. So it's off. Give it a little bit. Oh, ta-da! Yeah. Now, if I use the rainbow lights, it's even worse. Check this out. Let's see how many points I can touch before the touch slider lights just turn off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's probably 9 from the sliding of my little finger there. So that's pretty interesting. The rainbow lights require more power. So if you want to avoid that from happening, although in play you should never be using more than 2 points at any given time, use some kind of external adapter. It's the same case with the PlayStation 4. However, more effort is required to cause the touch slider to drop. Let's see what happens if I try to fully saturate the slider right now. It survived. This kind of suggests that the PlayStation 4 does provide more power than the Switch, which is not too surprising. They are USB 3 ports after all. Now let's see what happens if I change to the rainbow mode. Let's see if I can get away with fully saturating this.
Almost. Ooh. So, it didn't quite survive, but I did have to fully saturate the rainbow mode for it to drop. And then it really quickly recovered itself. Alright, so this adapter says that it provides 5 volts and 1 amp of power. Let's see what happens if I use this one. And into the wall. Alright, now we're using the wall, so let's see if it survives a full saturation with the random adapter I found. Now, as you can see, no problem. So if for some reason you do think you're going to play by fully saturating the touch slider, you'll want to use an external adapter.
Speaking of external adapters, not all USB adapters will work though. Like the Nintendo Switch adapter won't do anything. Perhaps because it is a dual voltage adapter that communicates with the USB device to decide what power to provide.
Failing that, again, no power adapter is actually required to play. It's only needed for the lights. The controller has a headphone jack which works on the PS3, PS4 and PC at this stage. The current firmware does not support the Switch, but DAO has told me that this could be fixed in a firmware update. Their website states that the chipset used is the same as a PS4 controller, with the 44 kHz stereo output. Just note that internally, the headphone jack wiring is a simple solder job. It turns out that when I was changing buttons, it seems that not much force is required to break that connection. So I hope that DAO considers a more robust implementation. I have to stress, I did change the buttons a lot. I have watched other reviews out there and not a single one has said that they have broken theirs. Before DIVA gaming. Before just jumping straight into the game, it pays to understand exactly how the controller behaves, and if there are any settings that you should set. I'll start off by pointing out that just like Hori, your headphone cable may trigger the touch slider, so you need to make sure it stays clear of it. Button layout. The standard buttons are self-explanatory on PlayStation as they are labeled as such. For Switch, here is a corresponding button mapped by the power of video editing. Really, the only potential confusing thing is the triangle, circle, X and square correspondence, given that they are laid out in a straight line. The FN button. Function. The controller looks like it has a start button, but actually it's a function button, used to change the controller's behavior and settings. It doesn't double as a pause button. In fact, it doesn't interact with the consoles at all, only the controller. The function button works in 2 ways. Primarily by holding it down, followed by holding another button on the controller for about a second to change a controller setting. The buttons will flash 3 times to confirm a setting input has been made. Secondly, there are 2 modes for this controller on the consoles, Future Tone and F&X Mode. Not too surprisingly, the modes are designed for different games. Given that this thing works on the PS3, PS4 and Switch, especially if you have access to all the Japanese games, that gives a lot of use for this controller. The face buttons behave differently in these modes. Holding the function button when playing the face buttons will swap the behavior. Personally, I don't really see myself using this, but it's handy to know. Speaking of Future Tone and F&X Mode, this is super important. By holding the function button and the very top L3 button for a second, It will toggle between the Future Tone and F&X modes. Future Tone mode has the face buttons act as only the face buttons, which is what you would expect. However, F&X mode has the face buttons also double as the D-pad directional buttons. And once again, holding the function button while hitting the face buttons will temporarily reverse these roles. So, when playing Future Tone or Megamix, you absolutely need to make sure you are using Future Tone mode. If you don't, you'll find certain situations in play will screw you up. For example, in Future Tone, when you hold multiple notes, if the controller is in F&X mode, you can easily drop notes or combos. And in F2 and X, as you may already know, the arrow notes require you hit both the face and D-pad buttons at the same time. If you are playing in Future Tone mode, these will be very hard to trigger, as you'd need to reach for the tiny function button on the right, or the directional arrows at the top left as well. Although F&X mode works on the Switch, there is no reason to actually use it on the Switch right now. But it is important to know that the mode does work, and will screw you up if you didn't notice the controller is in this mode before play. And that is entirely possible, as you may have done the menu navigation with a regular controller. There is no indicator on the controller to tell you what the mode is set to. An easy way to test? Just go to an empty or safe spot in the home menu and press a face button. If it also moves the cursor in any direction, you know it is set to F&X mode. In fact, the home menu is probably where you will first notice. When I first plugged the controller into the PS4, when I tried to launch Future Tone, because circle is accept in Japan, and also acts as right, the controller just told me, "Nope, I'm not launching that. Time to play X instead." As mentioned earlier, you can temporarily swap the modes by holding the function button when you hit a face button. Very good for quick menu navigation. For example, if you are in Future Tone mode, if you hold the function button and tap triangle, which usually just taps triangle, it will act as both triangle and up. And in F&X mode, which usually hits both buttons at once, holding function will make the buttons temporarily only act as the single face button. So, in knowing this, when playing F2 or X, you may need to either hold the function button to prevent odd menu behavior at times, or constantly switch modes when in menus or in play.
In order to demonstrate how crazy the menu navigation can be in F&X mode in F&X, let's take a look at the free play song selection screen. Now usually up and down would change the song, left and right would change the difficulty, triangle would preview the song, which I have disabled for YouTube purposes, and square would bring up the sort menu. That's interesting. It's acting as left. And that makes sense because in F&X mode, the face buttons double as the directional ones. In order to bring up the sort menu, you need to hold the function key and then press square. So, square in the menus is acting as left. Triangle is acting as up. So you would think that X would act as down, but it cancelled. Or circle would act as right, but it accepted. So it turns out that in the menus, these two buttons, the directional keys are taking precedence, and with these two buttons, the face buttons are taking precedence. Of course, the song play itself is perfect. F&X mode was designed for it after all.
Personally, I prefer just to use the DualShock controller, for these games were designed for them in the first place. If you are playing Future Tone and you are in F&X mode, you will run into button jamming problems. Here is why. On consoles, you cannot press opposite directions on the D-pad at the same time. Because consoles do not accept opposite directions on the D-pad to be pressed, F&X mode can completely screw up your game in Future Tone or Megamix. Since F2 and X mechanics are built for a controller, where no opposite directions are ever pressed, and no more than one face button is pressed at any given time, you'll have no problem.
Just be careful if you do use this controller to play Dreamy Theater, F or X games with the controller in F&X mode. You need to basically make sure you never hold buttons, always tap them. Otherwise, you might have crazy stuff happen due to the whole D-pad thing.
The behavior of trying to press opposite directional buttons at the same time is different on each console. On Switch, up and left takes precedence. So if you hold down and press up will overwrite the down input, which means when you let go of up, down will re-register the press. Same with right and left. If you are holding right and you press left, left will overwrite. Then right will repress when you let go of left. If you try to do it the other way around, for example, hold up and press down, down just won't be registered at all. Or if you're holding left and press right, right won't be registered at all.
Having said that, the Joy-Cons do act differently. They have been designed to be able to press them separately, like when holding them sideways for some multiplayer games, so no button clashing happens. The button press test even shows them being different to the D-pad.
On the PlayStation 4, it's as if you are rocking between buttons. So it will register the second press and flick back to the first input again when you let go of the second press. No precedence. Finally, out of curiosity, in F&X mode, the big buttons take precedence over the actual D-pad arrow buttons. So, for example, if you hold triangle, no amount of spamming up on the D-pad will do anything.
Let's double check the behavior of the modes on both consoles, especially the behavior between the two left and the two right buttons. You'll find that many controllers are built in a way that you can't press opposite directions on the D-pad at the same time. I assume that the inputs were therefore programmed in a way that reflects this, possibly for reliability or stability purposes. As said before, the separate buttons on the Joy-Cons don't have this problem. The function button isn't only to toggle Future Tone and F&X mode, however. While holding the function button, you can do the following.
L3 switches between Future Tone mode and F&X mode. The next three are really only for PC only. L2 switches to PPD mode. That's Project DIVA, a fan-made PC game.
L1 switches to DS4 mode.
And R1 switches to a 16-key mode. On the PS4 and Switch, trying to change modes will disconnect the controller. For PS4, hitting home reconnects the controller as a PlayStation 4 controller again. And on the Nintendo Switch, it just automatically reconnects and works like a Switch controller again. Future Tone and X Mode seem to be the only thing that make a difference on these consoles. Then, for the slider lights, left and right changes the hue, up toggles between the water ripple effect and a rainbow effect. Note that while holding the function button, when you hit other buttons, the controller will still send the basic signal through. So, you may end up navigating menus or doing weird things in-game while you change the controller's settings. So, in short, make sure you're using the correct mode and have fun changing the lights. It lights up. Slider behavior. So now we know how to prep the controller for a game. However, before we jump into Project Diva, it's still best to understand how the slider actually works. This way, we can adjust our play based on any magic powers that we are given or limitation that the controller has.
The best way to understand that is on the PC controller's properties window. We can also confirm the behavior on the Switch's control stick calibration menu, and by playing another game.
The touch slider is where this controller gets really interesting. It emulates a slide left or right to satisfy Project Diva Arcade's control style by triggering the analog sticks. When you place a finger on the touch slider, basically nothing happens. But when you flick left or right, the left analog stick engages the corresponding hard left or right. If you do the same with two fingers at the same time, both the left and right analog sticks engage, with the leftmost input acting as the left input. The cool thing is, it doesn't matter where on the touch slider you engage the inputs. So you can trigger two swipe nodes on the right side, or two swipe nodes on the left side. It is possible to change the direction of swiping without letting go as well. It gets weird though, when you try to introduce a secondary input when you started with just one. Prepare yourself, as this may get a bit confusing. The moment you touch a second spot of the touch slider, the first input basically locks in its direction until either you input a second direction or let go of both completely. Basically, once you have engaged in a second input, the slider wants two active inputs to register any change. Letting go of either input will stop the right analog stick action but continue the left one. It doesn't matter if you let go of the left or rightmost input of the slider. Re-adding the right input requires a left input update for both of them to register again.
Alright, but this part is a little bit weird. So before, when I'm doing this, right, if I swipe right and touch, nothing happens. But if I swipe left and then touch, it doesn't work that way with this side. So if I type touch and try move, nothing. If I do this, left, touch, no. It's only if I swipe right,
Left?
then touch here, it seems to work. Pretty weird, huh? But for all intents and purposes, the next part, yeah, let's ignore that.
Let's go over that again with examples. Using the Final Fantasy VII demo. Single input. I touch the slider anywhere, nothing happens. I swipe left or right. Cloud hard runs left or right. I can change his direction without lifting my finger. Two inputs. Using my left hand, I swipe left. Using my right hand, I swipe right. Now Cloud runs left while the camera spins right. So the leftmost input is the left analog stick. The rightmost input is the right analog stick. Same happens if I swipe right and left as well. I can change the direction of either stick, no problem. Engaging or disengaging one input. This is where the weird behavior begins. Starting with one hand swipe, if I touch anywhere else, I can no longer change Cloud's movement direction, even if I let go of the second input again. If I add a second swipe, the camera also starts working. When I remove one hand, the camera stops fine, but I can no longer change which direction Cloud runs. It doesn't matter if I let go of the left or right hand, the behavior is the same. However, the moment I add the second hand back, the camera does nothing until I swipe left or right with the left hand. This will re-engage the last camera input along with Cloud's running direction. Hopefully, along with the visuals, that made sense. In understanding this, we know that when playing Project DIVA Future Tone or Megamix, we do not, under any circumstances, enable the dedicated controller option in Future Tone or Megamix. That option expects an entirely different instruction set, so it won't work. And in terms of playing Future Tone or Megamix, basically you can use the slider almost just like the arcade. The difference being you don't have to travel for longer arrow notes. Just swipe and hold instead. But do be careful. You can jam it if you use two hands when there are a fray of slide notes, if you don't let go fully of one hand before you swipe with the next one. The last thing to note is that the distance between both inputs needs to be, ideally, 6 centimeters or more apart. According to the Windows controller test, 2 fingers close together counts as one input. 2 fingers a little over 1 centimeter apart, and changing directions becomes unreliable. 2 fingers about 5 centimeters apart, and swiping becomes unreliable. Enough of a gap and 2 controls are activated. This is about 6 or 6.5 centimeters apart, or the gap between the S and the E written on slider. So if you watch the detailed Hori slider video I put out, you will see that I did some stuff you won't be able to get away with on this controller. That is, unless DAO implements support for the in-game dedicated slider, in which case the slider may behave identical as Hori. Oh yeah, it is possible to trigger 2-finger slides with one hand. See the suggested gestures on the manual for this. Here is how to fail due to the slider. Basically, don't add a second input with single slide notes. Here are a couple of examples to show that it's pretty rock solid. Knowing how you can break it means you know what to avoid, and when to avoid it. From here, you shouldn't have any problems passing songs, other than your own skill level getting in the way. So finally, about Project DIVA. In an attempt to be as YouTube algorithm friendly as possible, I have to play without song audio in this particular video. From this point, we should already have a fair idea of how this will work. The slider has been programmed to emulate the analog sticks in a way that we don't need to define any controls in the game. Default controls are fine. Instead, we tell the controller what game we are playing. In Future Tone and Megamix, again, don't turn on the dedicated controller option when using this. That option, at this stage, is specific to Hori's official controllers only, and will completely make DIVALLER's slider unusable. Using DAOs, buttons and switches. As said at the start of the video, the triangle button was sticking out of the box. If I push the button toward me, it would get stuck, which, for me, is commonly done in regular gameplay. So gameplay at first was trying to manage this. So far, only the triangle has stuck for me. DAO said that the SANWA buttons are also prone to sticking, but that hasn't happened to me. As a result, DAO gave me an instructional PDF to reset the LED and springs. So button sticking could, or perhaps will, be a thing that you have to troubleshoot. I recommend asking other DIVALLER owners or reviewers what their experience has been as well, if doing any maintenance is something that you are uncomfortable with. Resetting the spring fixed the button sticking for me. Problem being, after leaving the controller for a week, then playing for about 5 hours, the button started sticking again. This time, if I put pressure towards the right. Repositioning the spring again fixed it again. You could find ways to mitigate this. For me, I ordered and tried SANWA 200 gram springs instead, and it didn't stick again. I wonder if the dual spring approach can lead to button sticking issues more frequently. You could also perhaps make the button or button housing more slippery with an appropriate material. Having said that, avoid using any sort of liquids, lubricants, creams, powders and so on, however. I found that just having a paper towel wedged at the problem point seemed to work, but paper will likely disintegrate quickly, and you'll need to find a way of keeping it in place. With the sticking button problem solved, in terms of physical performance, they feel really responsive. If you like feeling a click giving you feedback that the button has triggered, then DAO switches are for you. The 100 gram and 60 gram springs that DAO includes with their own buttons provide a good weight to them too. Of course, these things are subject to personal opinion, so you may find yourself wanting to get hold of stronger springs. I feel like the resistance increases ever so slightly just before the click, so it's hard to try to play super softly. With more force required to activate them, they are a little less prone to activating if you brush against them compared to the SANWA with 100 gram springs config. However, when you start playing a song with any speed and hit buttons at a heavier force, you probably won't even notice that they click, as the button itself impacting the housing will far outweigh that. At that point, the most important difference really comes down to the springs being used. As for SANWA,
In terms of sticking, they never failed me.
remember DAO tells me that the SANWA buttons can stick too though. The 100 gram springs that DAO included with SANWA orders are a little too soft for my liking. But you can order more springs and do some adjustments yourself. It's actually a really easy thing to do. It's kind of weird actually. The mushier feel actually makes it feel cheaper, even side by side with your own on-on switch option. Although you could also argue it's less fatiguing, less likely to break a nail or make your fingertips numb. You can also adjust to play lighter overall, which may reduce noise, but I doubt it when stuff starts to get more hectic in game.
At the moment, 200 gram springs are installed in all 4 SANWA buttons. They sound like this. Okay, now that the 100 gram springs are installed, let's see what they sound like.
The downside to using 100 gram springs is that while playing, I did accidentally bump and trigger a button a few times. To compare the two when actually playing, in terms of feel, if you are a hard hitter, DAO's buttons will suffice. I changed one of the buttons to SANWA and played with the other 3 as DAOs, and if I'm hitting with some level of force, I can't really tell which button's which. But if I play lightly, then the SANWA difference is noticeable. With 100 gram springs, they are effortless to trigger, but maybe too much so, as I bumped the button triggering it a few times, which I never remember doing with DAO's buttons and switches.
Actually, you know what? The SANWA 100 gram is easy to hit in quick succession with a single hand.
To reiterate, DAO switches have a tiny bit of resistance build up and then satisfyingly click. SANWA is smooth sailing and activates at a certain point. So with SANWA, you could hit a note in complete silence. Something you won't be doing when playing songs properly though. As I felt the 100 gram springs were a bit soft, I ordered a pack of 200 gram springs from SANWA. And as soon as I put them in, I got 2 new high scores right off the bat. Coincidence? I think, probably. It is very solid, and it reduced the number of erroneous button presses. Personally, this improved the fun factor for me instantly. I suddenly felt like I'm using much higher quality buttons that are not going to defy my skill. I tried for lols to put a 200 gram and 100 gram spring in one SANWA button, but all it did was cause the button to immediately stick. So, maybe the sticking issue with DAO's buttons are, in fact, the use of two springs. I changed the dual 100 gram and 60 gram springs in the triangle button with a 200 gram SANWA spring and played for several hours, no problem. Although I haven't had a problem, I wonder if the 100 gram springs paired with SANWA are a little too weak. That can cause the buttons to stick as well. You know, like not enough force to push the button back up properly. Across all controllers seen in this video, if you have only ever played with a standard PlayStation 4 or Joy-Con controller before, it's worth noting that one thing you will need to do, other than learning the arcade layout, is adjust your timing to get the most out of hold notes without failing the next note compared to playing on a regular controller, where you can just hold one button, then hit the alternative button. Either that or reach for the tiny D-pad at the top left of the DIVALLER, but yeah. This means that if you put masters of both a standard controller and a DIVALLER head to head, the controller wielder will have an advantage in that they can hold notes and kick in the next note without any gap in between them. But for me, it's just nowhere near as fun. With both the Hori and DIVALLER, if I do a button finger to thumb flick test, I can manage to switch from my fingers to thumb quick enough to see the button light turn on and off again, but not actually trigger in game. I don't think this is any different to the real arcade either, so I went there to try it out and... I couldn't actually manage to replicate that, so the arcade cabinet is doing something special. I wouldn't expect a godlike, flawless performance here regardless of the controller of choice. A regular controller may be capable of higher scores, but as I said, not as fun. Having said that, realistically, you shouldn't have any problems in regular play. Only if you are really, really trying to milk a hold note could you end up dropping the next note instead. If you use the same part of your hand, then you wouldn't ever have this problem, but you'd also get slightly lower scores. This happened to me 2 or 3 times when I was consciously trying to milk hold notes, rather than just getting into the rhythm and playing without thinking. And this is what's important. If I play long enough to forget that I'm trying to pick a controller apart, do I make mistakes? And are they specifically the fault of the controller? At times, I found myself enjoying the game just like I am at the arcades. There are moments that take me out of that zone though, mostly when there is a ton of slide notes. I did occasionally jam the slider due to the nature of how it emulates 2 sticks, so I found myself restarting songs once or twice to be more deliberate with how I use DIVALLER's slider. I also had the skin on my finger bounce or just stick to the surface of the DIVALLER slider, so it's probably best to play wearing gloves. Something that I didn't have quite so much problem with the Hori or the arcades. Comparing Hori and the DIVALLER. As long as the DIVALLER buttons don't stick, I haven't had any problems passing songs with either Hori or DIVALLER's buttons. You should pick based on your personal preference and wallet. Note that DIVALLER is green-lit for opening the controller and pulling the buttons apart, so you can essentially make your own adjustments if you want. Hori has a warranty sticker over a screw, so they don't want you doing this, suggesting they would rather you go through warranty claims if you have any problems. Theoretically, you could order this controller then buy SANWA buttons, switches, and cables separately, but it will be way more expensive than opting for SANWA to start. The slider. DIVALLER is good enough. It's not perfect, but neither is Hori's. Basically, for me, DIVALLER is more reliable to find based on feel, and it's easier to do long slide notes. It's best used with gloves. The fact that I can swipe a short distance and hold for the long slide notes can make me lazy, posing less of a challenge like Hori or the real arcades. Just be careful, if there are a lot of fast, short slide notes and you are using 2 hands, you can jam the slider if you don't deliberately release one hand before you use the other. So for an avid arcade player, they may take a moment to adjust to the DIVALLER, and also the slider is a little bit higher than the arcades. Hori's slider has the real arcade mechanics. But thanks to their physical design choice, you can overreach without realizing and wonder why your inputs are not responding. In terms of ergonomics versus the arcade, Hori veers down similar to the arcades, but the arcades cut off clearly, so with Hori, seasoned arcade players need to adjust to the fact that they could overreach and swipe a non-existent slider. With both controllers right here, I need to decide if I want the real mechanics with Hori or a slider that I have more success with. The Headphone Jack. If you must use the Headphone Jack, DAO says that they use the DualShock's chipset, and as such, it currently only works on the PS3 and PS4, and PC. But, like my Hori video, you will experience a little more delay if you use it. So I actually would avoid it if possible. Test results later. It's louder than Hori's Headphone Jack though. Comparing with the arcades. The arcades are the closest thing to real-time feedback out of all options. But of course, you need access to an arcade machine, which is pretty hard to find outside of Japan. You could potentially buy your own, but it'll be a lot more expensive than any of these controllers. The arcade slider doesn't seem to feel like I absolutely need gloves to play. They also light up by command of the game, such as sections of the slider lighting up during loading, representing the different singers that will appear in the song. The L and R lighting up, letting you know that you can use the sides to navigate songs, choose modules, and so on. Thus, the slider in the arcade feels more interactive, where Hori just tracks your finger, and DIVALLER has its own separate programming. Fun fact though, I heard people got the DIVALLER lights working just like the arcades at home on PC. I'm sure a very brief search will have you find this. DIVALLER with SANWA and 200-gram springs has the same button feel. If they do a firmware update to support the slider like Hori, then the PlayStation 4 with the DIVALLER will be as close to the arcades as you could get. Since Hori does support the dedicated controller option, Hori is currently the closest that you can experience to the arcades. That is, once you get used to that dead zone. But again, that's only if you have a Japanese copy of Future Tone on PS4 or you are playing the Switch version. Unless the international versions finally do add the dedicated controller option, that is. Computer. PC Master Race. When connected, the game device you see connected all depends on the controller mode you have selected. Even the audio jack will appear accordingly. Mind you, I tried plugging headphones in and they seem to go at max volume, regardless of the volume I try to set in Windows. I could control volume in games or with the volume sliders in video players and so on, but some things are obviously just way too loud. So, do not wear your headphones when you first try plugging them in, just in case they or your ears explode due to high volume. Mode behavior. DS4 mode basically has signals work just like a DualShock 4, with the touch slider working as described on the PlayStation 4. Thus, of course, missing some analog stick movement. PPD mode, which is basically a fan-made Project DIVA game, works similar, but depending on swipes, it will activate certain buttons instead of analog sticks. This basically means you can set up PPD to work arcade style. The 16-key version is beta right now and acts as a keyboard, although it still detects as a game controller as well, just every button press is a keyboard press. Interestingly, you could use your whole arm and touch the slider for it to type out an amazing secret message. I'm not sure the purpose of this, but the two left buttons serve as full stops and the two right buttons serve as closed square brackets. Given that two buttons do the same thing, it kind of makes the big face buttons extremely limited in functionality in my opinion, especially as you can basically do a button press down, then push another button, then release the first one without any register of a button release. But I managed to play some DJ Max silently by using the touch slider in this mode. Got a counter ready? I'm about to say USB a lot. GamoTwo recommends using USB 3 ports when possible. I tried connecting both the controller and the slider lighting to USB 2 and USB 3 ports to no noticeable difference though. I even did slider and button slapping with that random web page to see how low I could get the shortest key press, and achieved 1 millisecond with both USB 2 and 3. Looking at the controller, I've only seen USB Type-B plugs in printers and things, only using a USB 2 interface. So I'm not entirely sure if technically using a USB 3 port will actually make any advantages in the end. A USB 3 port will emulate a USB 2 port should you connect a USB 2 device to it. Though a quick check online and I found some claims that transfer rates were a tad faster, even on their USB 2 device. But I've had cases where USB 2 devices worked better on USB 2 ports too. Maybe do your own test here before deciding whether or not to connect the USB Type B cable to a USB 3 port or not.
DAO basically said it doesn't matter if you use a USB 2 or 3 port for data, just that a USB 3 port for the USB-C cable is important for reliable slider lights.
Oh, and avoid USB hubs for the lowest possible delay. Connect directly to your PC's motherboard's USB ports if possible. With all that, just try a different USB port if one seems slow for you. Okay, USB talk over.
Input delay tests. Note that every display is different. Some are faster than others. This is known as input delay, not response time, which is usually what manufacturers advertise. So your number of frames or milliseconds between a button press and seeing or hearing a response will likely be different to mine. In saying that, my tests are using the same equipment, so it will give you an indication of what the best way to play is.
Video delay. To test the delay between me hitting the button and seeing it go off on screen, I filmed in 60 frames per second and counted the number of frames between the button light going off and the in-game frame going off. I noticed with my camera, the video shows changes on the left of the screen earlier than the very right. For example, here you can see that the direct feed changes the entire screen in one frame, but only part of the left of the screen has turned white on my monitor. In fact, it can take up to 3 frames for the entire display change to be caught by the camera. I am pretty sure this is to do with rolling shutter on the camera, as I don't notice a wiping effect on the Atomos Ninja screen itself. So that would be part of the reason for the discrepancies in counting frames. This is mostly to see the delay between the PS4 and the Switch, and if there is any difference in input delay between the DIVALLER and the Hori. I recorded and counted frames for at least 50 notes, attempting to match any phase of the button with the screen itself. I didn't rely on the direct feed because any rolling shutter will also affect the button lights. I counted the same notes from the songs to keep the test fair.
Here we can see that the Switch seems to be about half a frame slower on average. It feels slower to me too. That, however, is likely due to the audio.
To test the audio delay, I plugged both the mic and the headphone out to my field recorder, hit some buttons, then measured the peaks in the waveforms. The field recorder did the work for both the game and mic audio at the same time, so there would be no delay between the recordings. As mentioned, I used the Atomos Ninja as a display. I tried using the display headphone jack, the controller headphone jack, and the Switch headphone jack to see what sort of delays there are between our different options. Note that with the DIVALLER, although I didn't think it was necessary as the whole controller is essentially the same, I also tried changing between SANWA and Omron switches.
There was no discernible difference.
I also repeated the test with Hori's controllers to expand the number of notes tested and in case any updates have changed anything.
Because Nintendo advertises the USB port at the back of the Switch dock as a future USB 3 port, I also timed this to see if there are any improvements versus the side ports as well. The results here show that the USB port at the back currently has no difference whatsoever to the 2 USB ports on the side.
At the time of publishing, the headphone jack does not work on the Switch. DAO Design told me that this may be fixed in a future update. I also tried the same thing on PC with DJ Max Respect to see if there are any differences between the Atomos display and the controller's headphone jack as well. Finally, out of curiosity, I even tried the same thing with both models of the PS4 DualShock controller and the Switch Joy-Cons to see if there are any noticeable differences. Again, I must stress that different displays will introduce different amounts of input lag as well. So my results are probably different to yours. If your display adds a ton of lag, then maybe the headphone jack or the controller is actually, in fact, better for you. Assuming that your display's input lag is relatively low, by looking at the typical statistical results, we can see an overall picture of what will provide you the best, most responsive experience. And here are the results.
And for a benchmark, here is the audio delay results from an actual arcade machine. So, by looking at the results, we learn that the fastest audio feedback is on the PlayStation 4 with the optical out connected directly to a stereo or headphone amp. I say that connecting to a TV is near enough though.
The headphone jack is usable on the PS4 and sounds great, but it adds a very noticeable delay, so should be avoided, as fast songs start to feel out of sync as a result. The PlayStation 4 controller is really quick, but when using the PS4 controller's headphone jack, it's significantly slower. So much so that the delay gap is wider and worse than the DIVALLER. GamoTwo say that they use the same chipset in the headphone jack, so I wondered if this is due to USB communication. I only have the original PS4 controller, which doesn't let you set USB communication under normal circumstances. So I asked around, and I was kindly lent a ZCT2 controller to test. The delay from the TV is much the same in Bluetooth or wired communication, so there is no reason to get a newer or older controller if you are trying to shave off any delay here. But if you use their headphone jack in wired communication mode, it's really virtually unplayable. Wired communication and the DualShock 4 ZCT2 headphone jack should never be used. You'll be putting yourself at a disadvantage in just about any game. Have a listen yourself to these different configurations. Remember that even if you adjust the timing in-game, it doesn't fix the fact that there is a delay between you hitting the button and hearing the feedback sound in-game. Using the Switch headphone jack is also pretty good, but you risk pulling the whole console over if you pull the cable at all. Imagine you do a one miss and you throw your head back in an moment, only to have the Switch fly across the room and slap you in the face. If you're wondering, why is there quite a large gap between the fastest and slowest hit in each test? There are too many factors as to why this is the case. Physical hardware reporting times, host hardware receiving or processing times, game design, and maybe more. I believe that a lot of things are likely processed in cycles, and that it requires them all aligning for the shortest variance in-game. I guess you could use it as an excuse. That could have been a perfect, but the game polled my button press too late. Curiously, Hori gave me slightly better results. However, we are talking in a 10 milliseconds range. To stress, this is so small, I don't think you could notice. It is less than a single frame at 60 frames per second. So in practice, I would consider it the same. Personally, I only really feel a difference if the gap is 30 or 40 milliseconds. There are three possibilities I can think of to the average being different here. First is simply a variance in the sample size, where a larger sample size may actually reduce or close the gap. The optical audio test shows just how true this is, with the average being less than 4 milliseconds between DIVALLER and Hori, or due to the button construction being different. It just so happens that the waveforms end up closer. The other possibility is that Hori uses an official chipset, therefore there could be a little less lag in the controller's signal processing stage. In any case, for this test, I determined that measuring 50 notes is only really enough to paint a general picture, not provide accurate results. For this, where the results are within 10 milliseconds of each other, just consider them the same. To give an example of just how fast 10 milliseconds is, watch what happens when I cut 10 milliseconds out of my voice and play it back. To give an example, those with sharp eyes may have noticed that I timed the switch undocked and got a slower response than DIVALLER. You may have thought that handheld mode would be faster, with less hops between the buttons and speakers involved. So what is going on? Wired communication mode. That's what. Looking at the averages, basically, the Switch Joy-Cons or Pro controllers and PlayStation 4 DualShock 4s should always be played wirelessly, possibly not connected to the console in any way. Don't use the controller's headphone jack either. On Switch, when docked, the Pro controller in wired communication mode shows a small increase in input lag, matching that of the undocked test I did. It doesn't matter if it's the back or a side USB port. Even if the Switch is undocked, having the Joy-Cons disconnected yielded better results. Charging, wired communication through the sides of the Switch or whatever. On PlayStation 4, for the DS4 Gen1, wired communication mode isn't supported. The headphone jack adds around a 60 millisecond audio delay. For the DS4 Gen2, wired communication doesn't seem to affect the input lag, but it adds an additional 40 milliseconds audio delay, making that gap a hideous 100 millisecond jump over the TV's audio. 3 times slower. 50 versus 150 milliseconds here. 150 milliseconds. My internet connection to the Americas is faster than that. The whole point here is to say, no, wired communication doesn't always mean better. DIVALLER is in fact better at processing audio through its headphone jack than an official DS4 controller. Still unusable, in my opinion. Summary. To summarize, overall, the controller build quality is satisfying. It provides a very close experience to the actual arcades, especially if you go SANWA. Just that the slider doesn't provide an exact one-to-one experience as the arcades. The best experience is via the PlayStation 4 and your TV's audio. I recommend using wired headphones connected to the TV. Just be careful that your headphone cable does not touch the slider during play. Make sure that you have the controller set to the correct future tone or F&X mode. The most noticeable pitfall for the DIVALLER is that the buttons can stick, so you need to be comfortable with opening the controller and doing a little maintenance from time to time. The second pitfall with the DIVALLER is that you can jam the slider when using more than one input at a time. This being more personal preference, the touch slider is an emulation. They haven't worked closely with Sega for a tighter integration. If you know how the emulation and the game mechanics for the analog sticks work, you'll basically be able to break some of the game. Whereas with Hori's controllers, they offer a more genuine arcade experience. But DIVALLER's still works, and in most cases is in fact easier, thus maybe your preferred playstyle. If you are not careful with performing surgery to the DIVALLER, you may break the wires soldered to the headphone jack. The real noticeable difference between DAO switches and SANWA is that DAO clicks. And you personally might prefer that feedback. Honestly, I actually don't think in play you will really be able to tell the difference. Unless you're using 200 gram springs with the SANWA buttons, the button weight of DAO's design is actually better. Stronger springs really make it feel better built. Although I believe that the durability of the Omron switches may have a higher chance of leading to servicing the controller, I also doubt you will ever need to. You probably occasionally need to reposition the springs, however. Suggestions. I've already relayed this to DAO, but the suggestions I gave them are: improve the headphone jack strength. You should do an awesome job on it, just like you did with your switches. That way, considering I've just shown people, users can feel confident that their headphone jack isn't going to break on them. Have the slider flash different colors depending on the mode selected, perhaps on startup, and especially when you change it, so that you can more quickly identify what mode you have selected. And I believe they are trialing the dedicated arcade mode option already. If not, they've already implemented it. GamoTwo and purchasing notes. If you would like to go ahead and order one, you can. Unlike Hori, which is a limited run Japan-only product, the DIVALLER can be ordered at any time, directly from GamoTwo from their website. They ship to many countries, so you probably won't need to use a forwarding company. Note that you have to make a choice when purchasing as to what buttons and switches you get. I highly recommend choosing which suits you best and just sticking with it over trying to source all the alternative parts yourself, unless that is your hobby, of course. And I hope that this video has helped you decide which is best for you. Here is their warranty statement from the manual. GameTwo does provide an international warranty as follows. If the controller doesn't work the moment you receive it, they will cover all return shipping costs and such. After a week, you will need to bear the shipping cost, so be sure to test your controller immediately after you receive it. But they will still do repairs and parts replacements for free. After a month, you will need to pay for any replacement parts if you send them your controller for maintenance. And after 180 days, it's just email support. Firmware updates. It is possible to do firmware updates using a PC. Firmware updates at this stage are notified on GameTwo's Twitter account, so be sure to follow them. Firmware can be updated by holding left, down, and right at the same time while connecting the controller to your PC. You'll then see that the controller is recognized as a different USB device when you do this. Once connected, let go of the 3 buttons, run their firmware update software, click connect, then load the firmware file. Currently, it doesn't seem obvious what firmware version the controller is already using. So I figure you should read the firmware update notes and just test if it is already installed before updating. Thank you. So that's it. That's just about everything I can think of. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you come out of this enlightened as to the ways of the Project DIVA ring. And again, a shout out to the people that made this possible. Thanks again to DAO Design at GameTwo for sending me the controller and both switch types to make this video for you. The DJ-DAO website featuring this controller is dj-dao.com. Their online store can be found there or at gametwo.com. And MikuFan. Thanks again to JR Harbert over at MikuFan.com for choreographing this review. Be sure to check them out. Links are in the description. And finally, thank you for watching.
.32 key controller? Expert controller? Expert controller?